Welcome to another episode of the 209 podcast. I'm Angelina Martin. This week, we welcome Congressman Josh Harder, who was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, the day of the Capitol riot. Now, while he wasn't in the Capitol for the actual riot earlier that day, he returned later that day to certify the election, and he had a lot of interesting stuff to say about the incident. Our sponsor this week is the City of Turlock Municipal Services. Now let's get into the conversation. Congressman Harder, thank you so much for joining us on the 209 podcast. We've spoken before on here, but I didn't think the next time that we met on here would be such a heavy time in American history, really. You were at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th when we saw a mob of rioters just, storm one of the most historic landmarks in our country. So I was wondering if you could just give us a firsthand account of what you saw, what you went through, because you were there. So where were you when everything started going down?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to chat. I know when we scheduled this, we didn't expect we'd have quite this much going on in the Capitol. It was probably the hardest week I've had being a member of Congress. It's been a long 2 years, but the last week was certainly the longest, and especially the events of Wednesday. When that was all happening, we had known in the morning that, and the weeks before, that security was going to be a challenge and that there were going to be a lot of threats. And so I was actually working from my apartment for the day. I knew that I would hope violence wasn't imminent, but we knew that it was a possibility. So I wasn't in the chambers when the rioters broke through the Capitol. I got a call around 1:30 or 2 p.m. from my chief of staff telling me that the security had been breached. And my first thought was for our staff. Most of our staff had been working remotely, but we had one team member who had been holding down the fort, quite literally, in our office. This, young guy, a year out of college. This was his first job, and here he is alone in our office as he's getting reports streaming through that the Capitol Police are being overrun. And so we evacuated him out of our office. We weren't able to get him to safety. He ended up basically being in lockdown for 12 hours or longer before actually getting home. And then, later that evening, I went to the Capitol because we had to work to certify the Electoral College votes. And it was just so sad seeing all of the destruction, shattered glass. I walked through this one door, the entrance to the Capitol, every single day. And everybody who was visiting the Capitol walked through the same door. And that night it had 3 bullet holes shattering the glass on all sides. And, in many ways, it felt more like a war zone than like a beacon of democracy that it should be for this country and the world.
Yeah, and your constituents and your followers on Twitter saw you tweet that photo of the bullet-ridden glass on the United States Capitol. It was a shocking image, but you said, you were not going to be intimidated and you went back to work. Was there any fear returning to the Capitol that night, or did you trust that the Capitol Police and the other forces that had come in for reinforcements had it under control?
Look, I think unfortunately the Capitol Police were wholly unprepared for what happened. And I think one of the things we really have to figure out over the next 9 days before Joe Biden gets sworn in is how do we fix the security challenges that we had. A police officer was murdered 50 yards away from where Joe Biden is going to take his oath of office in another 9 days. So we really quickly have to figure out it's probably not just the Capitol Police taking responsibility for this. It's the DC Police Department, security, the Secret Service, the National Guard. But that evening, the work we had to do was pretty clear. We have a constitutional obligation as members of Congress to certify the vote. And I was very saddened to see that there weren't just a lot of incitements to violence that led to the events of that day, but even in the vote that evening, we saw 60% of my colleagues on the other side in the House vote to not count ballots from states just because they didn't vote for the Republican candidate. They didn't vote for Trump. And so 60% of the Republican colleagues thought that was, was a reason for us to not certify the election as a free and fair election. And frankly, that was almost as disturbing as the events that happened in the Capitol earlier that afternoon.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you stayed home that day because you had heard of these rumors or of these reports that there were going to be protests. I saw photos from inside of the Capitol of that day of, I saw Representative Jim Costa, who represents Merced County and our 209 community of Hillmar. I saw a terrifying photo of him. It was crazy to see him. He's on the ground and you can see the fear in his eyes as he's holding a gas mask in his hands. Why do you think others chose to go to the Capitol that day when they knew that there was I don't know if they knew if there was a chance of something like this happening, but I mean, you stayed home. So what went into that decision and why did others choose to go to the Capitol, do you think?
Well, it was obviously a momentous occasion. I mean, this was, we knew it was going to be a big legislative day. Certifying the Electoral College votes is a responsibility for Congress enshrined in the Constitution. And so it was really important that we were there at some point, and the debate was already happening. I was planning to be there probably an hour after the Capitol was breached because we were going to need to vote. And then that vote ended up getting postponed. And so I think there was a lot at stake. And so I, don't fault folks that felt like they had a responsibility to go in early and see the situation for themselves. But at the end of the day, what happened was completely unacceptable. I mean, we saw rioters take over the Capitol, invaders coming in for the first time since the British took over the Capitol in the War of 1812, 200 years ago. And unfortunately, it wasn't just a responsibility that was on the folks that engaged in the violence. There were a lot of people who incited this violence, and they need to be held to account.
Yeah, this was, or for those who don't know, our listeners, Josh Harder was elected to Congress in 2018. So this was your first time having the chance to vote to certify an election. What was it like to kind of have that taken away from you? I mean, I know you got to vote eventually, but obviously it wasn't how you thought your first time certifying a president-elect would be.
Yeah, well, look, the Constitution really only gives the formal authority in Congress, but it shouldn't really be used. The real authority for counting the votes of the American citizens for president and higher office is in the hands of the states and county registrars across the country. And I think it's really unfortunate that over the last couple of months, folks have thrown out a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened in the election that have cast doubt and undermined trust and confidence in our electoral system and led to these results being challenged. I think the fact that 60% of Republicans in the House didn't think that Arizona and Pennsylvania should have their electoral votes counted. I think that should be a wake-up call to figure, how far we got down this road and how we can get off it. Because I think that doubt and conspiracy thinking is exactly the same type of behavior that led to, violence in the Capitol, and we got to make sure that it doesn't continue.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think, look at what happened last Wednesday on January 6th as a representation of, the 75 or 70 to 75 million people that did vote for President Trump. We live in a purple district. District 10 is pretty much split down the middle, Republican and Democrat. To you, did the mob that stormed the Capitol, is that representative of what you see here in District 10 of people who support President Trump?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And in fact, all day as things were happening, I was getting calls and messages from Trump supporters and Republicans throughout the Valley who were just as appalled by what they saw as I was. And they were very clear. This is not what we believe in. I mean, I got messages from law enforcement officers who were horrified that we saw rioters picking apart and murdering a police officer. And so I certainly do not think that these rioters are emblematic of the Republican Party or even of Trump supporters. But I think they were egged on by leaders who saw a selfish political interest in continuing to push that narrative and that rhetoric. And so I'm glad the Valley, we haven't seen anything like what we saw at the Capitol, but I still think it's going to be a responsibility for all of us to make sure that what happened in DC doesn't get mirrored in communities like ours across the country. And we can't allow that to happen.
We've seen so many videos come out from Wednesday. That's one of the, I guess, upsides, and it's also a downside of this time, is that everything is on video. We see, sometimes graphic images from events like this, and we've seen videos of Capitol police officers both protecting the Capitol with their lives, as well as others, seemingly taking photos with the people who breached the Capitol and chatting it up with them. So as someone who, goes to the Capitol every day, and essentially these people are protecting you every day, what is your thought on that and kind of the discrepancy that we've seen between, different sorts of officers in the Capitol and their reactions to this?
Well, we clearly need a full top to bottom investigation of why the Capitol Police was not more prepared for the violence, and then what happened during the riot itself. And to your point, there certainly were Capitol Police officers who did absolutely heroic things. I mean, there was a video that came out yesterday of one Capitol Police officer appearing to actually distract a bunch of rioters from the Senate chamber to allow Vice President Pence and other senators to escape. I really think in some ways it's actually a miracle that the violence on Wednesday wasn't even worse. Over the days afterwards, we've actually found, or law enforcement has found a lot of pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails and a lot of guns. I mean, and 5 people died. It could have been much, much worse. And I think we know that in some ways, there are some folks that have been emboldened by what happened on Wednesday, and there's potentially some things that are going to happen over the next 9 days that we need to be prepared for, is leading up to Joe Biden's inauguration. But regardless, there has to be an investigation, and the leadership for the Capitol Police and even individual officers who may have had malicious behavior need to be held to account. And that's why the chief of police of the Capitol Police has resigned. The sergeant of arms at the House and the Senate have resigned. And they don't, not only do they need to be replaced by a set of leaders who are able to reform this agency and ensure that we have national and domestic security at our Capitol, we need to figure out what went wrong and how to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Are those law enforcement leaders resigning in DC? Is that a sign of culpability, or a sign of, remorse and letting someone else step up who can maybe do a better job?
Well, I think it's the onus is on any leader. If you are a leader through a catastrophe, which I think Wednesday was for our Capitol Police Department, and you were unprepared for the events that happened, you need to take responsibility for that. And I think that's what we've seen. But that's sort of a longer term challenge. What we really need to make sure happens is over the next 9 days, we have to make sure that when Joe Biden gets sworn in 50 yards away from where a police officer was murdered, that we need to make sure that he is kept safe, that every other leader there, Republican and Democrat, is kept safe through that process, and that we have a peaceful transition of power. I mean, that's been the hallmark of American democracy for centuries. And it's not just us. I mean, every country in the world is looking at our example right now, and we got to make sure that it happens peacefully and without a hitch.
The violence that we saw on Wednesday, arguably as a result, I think most people can say, of, one of the most divisive times in our nation's history politically. You guys went back to the Capitol that night and certified the election, Republicans and Democrats alike. I know some voted the opposite of what you would have, but what was it like to go back that night? Was there a sense of unity between you and your colleagues on the Congress floor? And because I know I watched and I saw Vice President Mike Pence say, "Let's get back to work." And that was it sent chills through my body given the events of the day. So what was it like for you guys? And was there kind of a bipartisan camaraderie?
I had hoped so. And I think throughout the day, there were some reports that some senators and House members were reconsidering their objections to counting the electoral votes. People like Senator Lankford from Oklahoma had second thoughts and realized the implications of what he was doing, casting doubt on the legitimacy of our elections. But then, of course, in the House, we didn't really see that. I mean, 60% of elected leaders of the House of Representatives voted to discount the electoral college votes of Arizona and Pennsylvania. And I remember vividly, I mean, we were there till about 4 a.m. Around about 2 a.m, we were having a debate around Pennsylvania. It was getting very heated. Obviously, temperatures in the room after the events of the day were pretty hot. And there was a moment where Al Lawson from Florida and Andy Harris from Maryland almost got in a fist fight and had to be restrained and pulled apart, just like you would see anywhere in America. And that was just a little ways away from where just hours earlier protesters had been trying to break in and hurt all of us, every member of the House. And I don't want to be melodramatic, but I was sitting there and I couldn't help think about 1861 and the caning of Senator Charles Sumner, which was one of the precursors to the Civil War. I don't think that's where we are today, but I do think that we are seeing political violence in our country that we have not seen for a very long time, and that leaders who have incited this violence, who have continued to fuel the flames of hatred and division, need to be held account, not just the people who engage the violence themselves.
You've always said that you decided to run for Congress. You were inspired by President Trump's victory in 2016 to dabble into politics yourself. Did you ever imagine that 2 years after being elected, you would be in a position like this and that the presidency would be ending like this in such a dramatic fashion?
Certainly hope not. I think it was very clear to me, and it still is, how deep the divisions are in our country. And we have real challenges, right? We have a pandemic that is leaving the Central Valley at 0% ICU bed capacity. We have 10 million people out of work, hurting across the country. We have real challenges in front of us, and I think it's totally understandable for us to have policy disagreements about the best way to resolve those challenges. These aren't easy problems. It's not easy to get a pandemic under control, or we would have done it faster. It's not easy to get people back to work as quickly and safely as possible. We can have very responsible disagreements about these policy issues, but in America, we have always been a nation of resolving those policy agreements at the ballot box. That is our system of laws. And I think what has really been beyond the pale is trying to satisfy those policy disagreements with violence, not even trusting the legitimacy of our political system, not having that confidence and trust. And I think that, we can add to the crises we have, a crisis of democracy. And it's going to take a lot of work, not just from our elected leaders, but from each and every one of us to figure out how do we go about rebuilding that unity, that confidence, not just in our political system, but in the very ability to resolve our disagreements without using force, because we have to make sure that we avoid what happened on Wednesday.
Yeah, if you look at the polling, an overwhelming amount of Republicans believe that, this election was not entirely truthful, that it was fraudulent. How do we go about restoring that sector's faith in democracy? Is it on the social media companies that are allowing misinformation? Is it on Congress? What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, it's not true. There are so many conspiracy theories about this election, but just look at the evidence. Look at the fact that most of what people are saying on Facebook or on Twitter, they're not even saying in a court of law. That shows how little evidence there is behind it. When the exact same people, when they stand in front of a judge on penalty of perjury, they're not making the same arguments that they're making when they're on social media and can say whatever they want without impunity. And so I think that there's a lot of work to do. I think one of the things we have to do is make sure that people who are lying to the American public face accountability, especially those who have engaged in the incitement of violence. There must be accountability for what we saw happen on Wednesday. Second, I really do think that we could do a lot more to resolve the misinformation and the fact that there's many different people that are seeing different shades of truth across the country. We need to get back to, a solid set of universally held truths and not, the fact where one person can have their own set of facts. One of the ways we do that is we need to make sure that social media companies put better police behavior on their platform. Right now, if you have a large social media platform, you are given an exception to the rules. We need to move towards the exact opposite, where the larger your platform, the more scrutiny you should receive. And this is for Democrats and Republicans. The more scrutiny you should receive to make sure that the things you are saying are accurate, are truthful, and are not doing things like inciting violence. And think about, you're a newspaper writer. Think about the standards that we have for libel for our newspapers. If you say something untruthful in a newspaper, you can get sued. But if you lie repeatedly 5 times a day on Facebook, you can't. And so we need to really think about how do we create better standards for behavior out there. And then absolutely, we need to restore confidence and faith in our electoral system. We need to make sure that we are doing a better job of making sure people can vote, making sure that voting counting happens in a clear and transparent fashion, and then making sure that a group of legislators that don't like the result can't just overturn the election because it didn't go in their favor. That's not right, and that's not the American way.
You talked a little bit about social media, which brought up the point to me that President Trump was banned from Twitter, suspended, whatever you want to call it, and from all of these different social media sites. I believe at the time of recording this, there's a planned protest outside Twitter headquarters that Trump supporters are planning. So is that a violation of someone's First Amendment rights to you, being banned from social media for spreading election conspiracies or things like that?
It's not. Look, no one should be censored for their political beliefs. Luckily, that's not what happened here. And the First Amendment protections are from people who are trying to protest their government. There's no First Amendment right to be on Twitter, just like there's no First Amendment right to have a nightly show on Fox or MSNBC, or an opportunity to go out and be heard by the entire world. Private companies have their own ability to figure out what they want to see on their platform, and ultimately, Twitter was used as a tool to organize the riot that we saw on Wednesday. There was, I think, was real lingering concern that people could use that tool to organize another set of attacks. That threat still exists, especially as we're looking towards the inauguration of Joe Biden in another 9 days. And so, I do think, though, that one of the things that we need from a legislative perspective is I don't want to see, companies like Twitter shooting from the hip here. I would like to see a better legislative standard that actually holds every company accountable for the behavior that they foster on their platform, not just Twitter, but some of the wild conspiracy theories and ugliness that we see at places like YouTube, and trying to make sure that we can get to a better information ecosystem, which in turn will lead to a healthier democracy.
Yeah. Do you think that should be one of the top priorities heading into the new Congress, getting a handle on these social media sites?
One of the priorities, I think we have a lot. I think if I were to say my top 3 priorities for the first 100 days of the Biden administration, first, we have to do a much better job of improving vaccine distribution. We had Operation Warp Speed and developing the vaccine. We have Operation Snail's Pace and actually making sure that vaccine is getting into people's arms as quickly as it needs to. And this should be a goal for all of us, because if we want to make sure that people get back to work, the fastest way to do that is to get this pandemic under control. And then second, we have to rebuild our economy. I don't think it's a coincidence that we are seeing this onset of political violence at a time when so many people are out of work and hurting across the country. And so we need to do a big infrastructure project. We need to make sure that we're investing in water infrastructure in our district and our roads and bridges across the country and in safe ways to make sure that we can get people back to work, making a living, so we don't have more people ending up on the streets or not able to put groceries on their table. And then third, I do think we have a democracy crisis where we need to make sure that we focus on a new Voting Rights Act, an ability to make sure that every American can vote safely, that those votes can be accurately counted. We need to end gerrymandering and restore the heart of the Voting Rights Act and end some of the political corruption and some of the abuse that we've seen over the last 4 years.
I wanted to bring up some dialogue that I've seen on social media over the past few days, and I'm sure you've seen as well. You were photographed at a vigil for George Floyd in Modesto over the summer, and we've seen a lot of people compare what happened on Wednesday to the Black Lives Matter protests we saw across the nation over the summer. I know they were mostly peaceful, but there were, some burning of police department buildings and private property. How do you think these two events compare?
Well, anyone who engages in violence should be held accountable. And so people that were trying to hijack the Black Lives Matter protests and engaging in violence, they should be arrested and they should be held accountable to the full extent of the law. Unfortunately, I think it's apples and oranges here. I mean, what we saw on Wednesday was a concentrated effort to overturn the legitimate results of a free and fair American election. That's a pretty big deal. And when you see thousands of rioters streaming into the Capitol in a truly malicious way, there's a lot of violence that's going on there. And I think that's a very different goal than people who are fighting to make sure that we have a criminal justice system that doesn't care about the color of your skin. And so, but that said, I certainly think that there are people who participated in Black Lives Matter protests for their own means and that hijacked those protests, and those people should be just as accountable as anyone who engages in political violence or violence of any kind.
Like we mentioned, a lot of people reached out to you. A lot of Central Valley residents and your constituents reached out to you, decrying this act of violence on the Capitol. But, I saw a lot of people decrying it, and I thought that maybe this would be a very unifying moment for our country. But based on what you said about what you saw on the House floor, it seems like maybe we are still a ways away from that. So what do you think we can do as a country, or even, you guys can do in Congress to kind of heal and unify the nation in the aftermath of this?
Well, I think we have to make sure that we are operating from a common set of values. And I think some of those values are, we all agree on, the strength of family and justice and all the rest. But one of the common set of core principles that every American should be able to agree to is that we resolve our disagreements through elections and that we have a belief in democracy. And unfortunately, that didn't seem to be a value that was commonly shared, at least not the evening of Wednesday, January 6th. And we saw 60% of the Republican elected officials in the House vote to not count those electoral votes. And so I really think that if we want an opportunity to unify, to come together, which we absolutely need to be, first, there has to be truth. There has to be a common set of principles that we can agree on. There has to be accountability for the people that incited that violence. And the reason that accountability is important is because that's the best way to ensure that it doesn't happen again. I think sometimes, we can't give people a free pass and say that, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and the people that have been lying about the results of this election for so long should be able to escape without any repercussions. That's not right, because that's how you make sure that years down the line, we're going to continue to see more events like we saw on Wednesday.
Now, Josh, I don't want to be all doom and gloom on this episode of the 209 podcast. And I know you mentioned you have a lot of work to do when the 117th Congress reconvenes. You mentioned vaccine distribution. What are some goals you have for District 10 in the new year?
Well, I'm hoping to make sure that we have our issues really understood. I mean, I think one of the things that we were really successful on in the last Congress is taking issues that nobody really thought about, things like nutria and swamp rats, and actually working to make sure that that got across the finish line. I mean, next time you're driving through the Central Valley and you don't see a giant rodent or swamp rat on the side of the road, you can thank our efforts in getting that done. And so I hope that over the next Congress, we're able to continue to do that. And really, my core goals come down to just 2 or 3 things. How do we keep people safe and healthy? How do we get people back to work? And how do we focus on the investments for the future of the Valley? Things like our water infrastructure, which have been, the focus of mine for a long time, to ensure that when we're passing the legacy that we've been given on to the next generation, it's stronger than ever.
Well, we at the 209 podcast are so looking forward to what you have in store for our community in the next year. We're so glad that you're safe, that you managed to avoid the violence at the Capitol on Wednesday. And really, we thank you for talking to us about it, because I know it probably wasn't fun to go through, wasn't fun to be in that city on that day. And so we appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective on it with us.
Of course. Thank you for all you do, and take care and stay safe out there.
Yeah, you too, Josh. Thank you. If you want to listen to more episodes of the 209 podcast, head over to 209magazine.com, Spotify, iTunes, or any other podcast platform.